Do you know that social movements play a very important role in our lives? Well, keeping this in mind, let's start with our last chapter, social movements. Let's first understand what are social movements. Well, social movements are organized efforts of people to bring about a change in the society through campaigns or protests, etc. These movements help to raise awareness of social issues and injustices that may have been overlooked. By mobilizing people and creating a sense of urgency, social movements have shaped the world we live in. How? Well, the right to vote of every adult, irrespective of gender, the 5 or 6 day work week, or the 8 hours of work, or equal pay for equal work for both the genders are some of the examples of rights that are an outcome of social movements. Behind the rights that we take for granted in our present time, there is a history of a long struggle in the past. Say, for example, the right to vote, guaranteed by our Indian Constitution. This right was non-existent under the colonial rule. Even in Britain, voting rights in the past were limited to property-owning men. Chartism was a social movement for parliamentary representation in Britain. In 1839, more than 1.25 million people signed the People's Charter asking for universal male suffrage, voting by ballot, and the right to stand for elections without owning property. It was only after World War I in 1918 that all men over 21, married women and women owning houses and women graduates over the age of 30 got the right to vote. Finally, through the suffragettes, all women, irrespective of owning property or being graduate, got the right to vote. Two more movements are worth noting. Number one, the civil rights movement in the US, somewhere around 1950s and 60s, that fought for equal rights for blacks. And second, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa against the oppressive policies of racial segregation of the white and non-white population. These movements have changed the world in fundamental ways, along with the nationalist movements all over the world. Let's move on to the features of social movement. Well, a social movement requires sustained collective action over time. Secondly, action is often directed against the state, demanding changes in state policy or practice. Third, they possess a degree of organization. That is, in a social movement, there is a leadership and a structure that helps in making and implementing decisions. Fourth, the people who are a part of the social movement have shared objectives and ideologies. Number 5, a general orientation or an approach to bring or stop a change. Note, these defining features are not constant. So, what is the purpose of social movements? Well, the purpose of social movements is to bring about changes on public issues, and these movements face a tough challenge and resistance in bringing about a change, since they go against vested interests and entrenched values. But over a period of time, changes do take place. Social movements often arise to bring about social change, but there are movements which arise in defense of the status quo. These are called counter movements. Example, when Raja Ram Mohan Roy campaigned against Sati and formed the Brahmo Samaj, the defenders of Sati formed the Dharma Sabha and petitioned the British government not to legislate against sati. So this is an example of a counter movement. Now, some social movements have a distinct mode of protest that can range from candlelight march or a torchlight march, or perhaps the use of black cloth. There will be songs, poetry, Karnatak or street theatre, to picketing or ahimsa, etc. The repertoire of Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha during India's national struggle consisted of wearing khadi, a protest march, that is the Dandi march to make salt. So the objects of the masses were converted into symbols of resistance. Now, it is tough to challenge the dominant society's perception, as is illustrated by Ankush Kale in his speech on his community, the Pardis. The Pardis are very skillful hunters, yet society recognizes them only as criminals and treats them in that way by enforcing a social distance. Since they have this label of criminals attached to them, they find it hard to get a job and thus end up stealing. The society is responsible for turning them into thieves. Thus, we see how a dominant society's perception can define a particular community. Now, let's make a distinction between social change and social movement. Now, social movements bring about social change. That is, social change is an outcome. Social change is continuous and ongoing. Social movements are directed towards some specific goals through a long and continuous effort. Example, Sanskritization and Westernization are social change. The efforts of the 19th century social reformers are termed as social movements. So, why is the study of social movements important for sociology? Well, the discipline of sociology arose from the need to understand the change that society was experiencing. From the French Revolution, which was a culmination of several movements, to the Industrial Revolution, which was marked by a big social upheaval. These affected the existing societal social order. Social movements were seen as forces that led to social disorder. So we have sociologists like Emile Durkheim concerned about how social structures are there for social integration. On the other hand, followers of Marx gave a different view of collective violent action. Like E.P. Thompson showed that the crowd and mob were not made up of anarchic hooligans out to destroy society. They had a moral economy, that is, a shared understanding of right and wrong, governing their actions. Example, poor people in urban areas resorted to public protest as they had no other option of expressing their anger and resentment against deprivation. Now let's look at theories of social movement. And there are three theories that are there in your book. The first one is the theory of relative deprivation. The second one is the theory of the logic of collective action. And the third one is the resource mobilization theory. We're going to go over them one by one. So let's begin with the first one, that is the theory of relative deprivation. Well, in this theory, social conflict occurs when one social group feels that it is worse off than others around it. This results in that group engaging in a collective protest. The psychological factors of resentment and rage are given prime importance in this theory. What are the limitations of this theory? Well, Perceptions of deprivation are not a sufficient reason for collective action and mobilization of people. The feeling of relative deprivation will not necessarily make them join a social movement to address their grievances. Grievances have to be discussed and analyzed so as to have a shared ideology and organization of people under leadership. Remember, there is no automatic causal relationship between relative deprivation and collective action. Let's look at the second theory, that is the theory of the logic of collective action by Manker Olson. Now, he believes that social movements are a collection of rational individuals who calculate individual costs and benefits before undertaking any action. They will participate only if the risks are less than the gains. Now, what are the limitations of this theory? Well, people who are a part of a social movement are all not rational. They are not utility maximizing individuals, and the success of the movement is not based on these utility maximizing individuals. Let's move on to the third theory, McCarthy and Zald's resource mobilization theory. Now, this theory says that the success of the social movement is based on its ability to mobilize resources or means of different sorts. A social movement must be able to bring together resources such as leadership, organizational capacity, and communication facilities, and use them within the available political structure. What are the limitations of this theory? Well, the scarcity of resources is not a constraint, as shown by numerous poor people's movements. Even if initially there were limited material resources and an organizational base, the movement can generate resources through a process of struggle. Hence, it is not limited by existing resources. So the thing to understand is that social conflict does not automatically lead to collective action. Social protests are more commonplace in the sense that they don't need an overt political mobilization. People may have a clear idea of how they are exploited, and we have James Scott's analysis in his book Weapons of the Weak, discussing how the peasants and the laborers in Malaysia manifested their protest against injustice through small acts, as that of being deliberately slow, as a form of resistance. Another example of the act of resistance as a survival strategy is the one used by poor women of South Asia who were forced to give up their small savings to their alcoholic husbands. So what these women do is that they hide their money in two places and they hand over only one part while the other part is safeguarded by them. Now we look at the types of social movement. There are three types of social movements. One is the redemptive, the second one is the reformist, and the third one is the revolutionary. So the redemptive movement means that there's a change in the personal consciousness and the actions of the individuals of a particular community. Example, the Izava community in Kerala were led by Narayan Guru to change their social practices. In the reformist movement, there is a change in the existing political arrangements through the gradual incremental steps. Example, the reorganization of Indian states according to language and the Right to Information Act. In the revolutionary movements, we have an attempt to radically transform social relations, often by capturing state power. Example, the Bolshevik Revolution that overthrew the Tsar to create a communist state, and the Naxalite movement that sought to remove oppressive landlords and state officials. In practicality, most movements have a mix of the elements of the above three movements. Also, the orientation of the movement varies over a period of time. Also, movement might start from a phase of mass mobilization and collective protest to become more institutionalized. When this happens, that means that this is a move towards social movement organizations. Perfect example would be Greenpeace. Also, how a social movement is perceived and classified is always a matter of interpretation. For example, the 1857 was a mutiny for the British colonial rulers, but it was the first war of independence for the Indian nationalists. Now let's move on to understand old and new social movements. Well, much of the 20th century, social movements were class-based. That is, we have the working class movement, the peasant movement, the anti-colonial movement. And the workers' movement in Europe gave rise to the international communist movement and the formation of communist and socialist states across the world. Most notable is the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. And also, this led to the reform in capitalism. How, you might wonder? Well, the creation of welfare states in Western Europe were partly due to the political pressure created by the communist and socialist movements. Since capitalism and colonialism have usually been interlinked through forms of imperialism, social movements have simultaneously targeted both these forms of exploitation, that is, against foreign power and dominance of foreign capital. Decades after World War II, we have the anti-war movements that were led by students. Now, this was at the time of war in Vietnam. So, we also have the Civil Rights Movement by Martin Luther King, the Black Power movement led by Malcolm X, the women's movement, the environment movement. Now, all these movements did not share a class identity or even nation identity. Rather, the identity was of students, women, blacks, or environmentalists. These movements were the new social movements. So, distinguishing the new social movement from the old social movement, let's first look at the case in India. In India, the old social movements functioned within the frame of political parties. That is, the role of the political parties was central. Example, the Indian National Congress, led by the Indian National Movement, the Communist Party of China, led by the Chinese Revolution. So, the old social movement saw the reorganization of power relations as a central goal. So, we have nationalist movements overthrowing colonial powers, working class movements in capitalist West fighting for better wages, social security, etc. from the state. Social movements establishing new kinds of states and societies. The new social movements were about quality of life issues, such as having a clean environment. They are also international in scope, such as the regulation of the World Trade Organization, as most forms are becoming transnational. So, can we apply the distinction between old and new social movements in the Indian context? Well, the key concern of movements, according to Gail Omwith in her book Reinventing Revolution, was to address number one, social inequality. Number two, unequal distribution of resources. However, these movements were not organized along class lines alone. So we have identity politics, cultural anxieties, and aspirations as the elements of a social revolution. And these unite participants across class boundaries. Example, women's movement includes urban middle class feminists as well as poor peasant women. So, a social movement can have social inequality occurring alongside other equally important issues, as they're not just about economic inequality or organized along class lines alone, and hence difficult to categorize as old and new social movements. Now, let's move on to ecological movements. When we read about the modern period, we find that there's been a lot of emphasis laid on development. And because of that, there has been a reckless use of the natural resources. And if you look at the model of development, you'll find that not all people are equal beneficiaries of this development. Let's look at the Chipko movement, and this is a perfect example of an ecological movement. Ramchandra Guha's book Unquiet Woods talks about how the villagers rallied together to save the oak and the rhododendron forests in the Himalayan region of Uttarakhand in 1973. When the government contractors came to cut the trees, the women of the village wrapped themselves around the trees and thus prevented them from being felled. So, on one hand, we have the villagers who are concerned about the ecological sustainability, as cutting down the forests would result in devastating floods and landslides in that region. They've already experienced that in the past. And on the other hand, we have the contractors who represented the government's plan of revenue generation from the timber that grew in the forest. So the villagers' concern was the ecological sustainability of cutting down forests, because this would result in devastating floods and landslides in that region. Also, the villagers valued the forest for its own sake as a form of ecological wealth. Of course, the forest was also a source of livelihood for them, but the forest benefits all, as trees are necessary for the conservation of the environment. So we have concerns about economy, ecology, and political representation as the three elements of the Chipko movement. Now we proceed to look at class-based movements, and under class-based movements we have the peasant movement and the workers' movement. The peasant movements or agrarian struggles existed from the pre-colonial period. These movements were disjointed, localized, and confined to particular grievances. For example, the Bengal Revolt of 1859 to 1862 was against the indigo plantation system. The Deccan Riots of 1857 were against the moneylenders. So some of these peasant movements became partially linked to the independence movement under Mahatma Gandhi, like the Bardoli Satyagraha of 1928, that was a non-tax campaign, and the Champaran Satyagraha between 1917 to 18, that was against the indigo plantation. So we see how peasant movements began to expand and become a part of the independence movement. Then the peasant movements began to develop into peasant organizations. The first organization to be founded was the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha in 1929, and in 1936 the All Indian Kisan Sabha. Now their demand was freedom from economic exploitation. So at the time of independence, two peasant movements are worth mentioning. One is the Tebaga movement, the other is the Telangana movement. The Tebaga movement between 1946 to 47 was the struggle of the sharecroppers in Bengal for 2/3 of the sharecropping. The Telangana movement was against the feudal conditions in the princely state of Hyderabad. Now let's look at the post-independence period, and here we have land reforms, the abolition of the zamindari system, the declining importance of land revenue, the public credit system. All these transformed the rural landscape. So, two major social movements again, which are worth mentioning. One is the Naxalite struggle, and the second is the New Farmers Movement. The Naxalite struggle started in 1967 in the Naxalbari region of Bengal. The central problem for the peasants was land. The New Farmers Movement, which began in the 1970s in the states of Punjab and Tamil Nadu. Now, these movements were regionally organized and they were non-party. That means that there was no political party behind the movement. And this movement involved farmers. These farmers were anti-state and anti-urban. The focus of demand was price and related issues, that is price procurement, remunerative prices for agricultural inputs, taxation, non-repayment of loans, etc. These farmers used new methods of protesting ranging from blocking of roads and railways to not allowing bureaucrats and politicians to enter their village. The farmers' movement have broadened their agenda and include environment as well as women's issues. So they can be seen as part of the worldwide new social movements. Now let's move over to the workers' movements. The 1860s saw factory production being taken up in India. The factories were established by the Britishers in the port towns of Calcutta and Mumbai. Labor was cheap, and there were no regulations made by the colonial government regarding wages and working conditions. So, did the workers protest against the injustice? Well, yes. The protests were, however, spontaneous and short lived. So, there were no trade unions at that time, and the nationalist leaders absorbed the workers in their anti colonial movement. Then, with World War, there was enormous expansion of the industries, but this brought further misery to the poor, as there was a sharp increase in prices coupled with food shortage. So there were a series of strikes in the textile mills, and the workers demanded an increase in their wages. In fact, in September and October of 1917, there were around 30 recorded workers' strikes. The first trade union was established in 1918 in Madras by B.P. Wadia, who was a social worker and a member of the Theosophical Society. Also in 1918, Mahatma Gandhi found the Textile Labor Association, or the TLA. In 1920, the All India Trade Union Congress, or AITUC, was formed in Bombay, and this was a broad based organization involving diverse ideologies, that is, the communists, the moderates, and the nationalists were a part of this group. With the formation of the AITUC, the colonial government began to grant some concessions to stave off social unrest. So, we have in 1922 the Fourth Factories Act that reduced the working day to 10 hours. To regulate the trade unions, the colonial government created rules for monitoring them. The unions had to be registered and work within the framework of regulations as per the 1926 Trade Union Act. By mid 1920s, the AITUC had about 200 unions affiliated to it. In 1947, AITUC split on political party lines. The Indian National Trade Union Congress Act, or INTUC, was formed in 1947. We have post-independence, the working class movement being divided on the lines of political parties at national level. Unions were formed at regional level too in the late 1960s. In 1966 and 67, there was a major recession which affected production and employment, and consequently there was a general unrest. Also noteworthy is the 1974 major railway workers' strike between the state and the trade union. During emergency in 1975 and to 1977, the government curbed all trade union activities for some time. Now note, the workers' movement was very much a part of the wider struggle for civil liberties. So, with liberalization and globalization, we find declining government intervention in the economy, a decline in the creation of public sector employment, and encouragement for the private sector. Efforts for forming a union in the private sector were often met with opposition, and with the wider general withdrawal of state support for the workers, the bargaining power of the workers got reduced. Now let's look at the caste-based movements. Under caste-based movements, we have the Dalit movement and the backward class movement. Let's begin with the Dalit movement first. So, the Dalit movement is not only resting on economic exploitation or political oppression, but is a fight against stigmatism. It is a struggle for self-determination. The word Dalit itself, whether in Marathi, Hindi, or Gujarati, connotes the oppressed person, that is, a person who has been put down in deliberate way, and this act being backed by the justification of caste hierarchy. Note, there has not been a single unified Dalit movement in the country till now. Overlooking the differences in the nature of the Dalit movements, there is a common quest stringing these movements for equality, self-dignity, and the eradication of untouchability. This can be seen in the Satnami movement of the Chamars in Chhattisgarh, the Adi Dharma movement in Punjab, the Mahar movement in Maharashtra, the Jatavas of Agra, and the anti-Brahman movement in South India. Now, sociologists believe that the Dalit movements have the elements of all three types of movements, that is, the reformative, the redemptive, and the revolutionary. Under the various social reformers and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, It was revolutionary in terms of society and redemptive in terms of individuals along caste lines. In contemporary period, there has been increased visibility of the Dalit movement. One aspect has been the growth of the Dalit literature. Dalit literature gives a call for social and cultural revolt. The Dalit writers have highlighted their cultural struggle for dignity and identity and also expressed their perceptions on the structural features of the society and its economic dimensions. So now let's move on to the backward class movement, and first let's understand that the term backward classes was used in different parts of the country since late 19th century. Their emergence as political entities has occurred both in the colonial and post-colonial period. In the colonial period, patronage was given on caste basis, and so people found it sensible to stay within their caste for social and political identity. Similarly placed caste groups on the social stratification scale found it better to unite and form what is termed as a horizontal stretch. Thus, caste began to lose its ritual content and become more secularized for political mobilization. So now let's examine how the upper caste felt with the increasing affirmative governmental action for the Dalits and the other backward classes. Here, let me first quote Mr. G.B. Pant, who said that the strength of the chain is measured by the weakest link of it, and so, until every link is fully revitalized, we will not have a healthy body politic. So, by and large, the conditions of all the social groups, including the lowest caste and tribe till now, has improved. There are numerous reasons for that. That is, with increasing urbanization, industrialization, and the expansion of occupations, coupled with the affirmative action for the betterment of the conditions of the marginalized by the government, there has been a change in the social landscape. Now, some sections of the upper caste feel that since they are not numerically significant enough, they are being overlooked by the government, especially after the Mandal Commission. In fact, before the Mandal, caste was almost invisible for the urban middle class. It was only relevant in the traditional rites of passage like marriage. Otherwise, it had no active role in urban everyday life. The most important reason for this was the homogeneity of caste members in the policy making circles. Since these contexts were overwhelmingly dominated by upper castes, caste identity was not an issue. It was an archaic concept for them. With increased awareness due to the Mandal Commission, the social visibility of other castes and their condition came into the forefront. Now let's look at tribal movements. Different tribal groups are found across the country and they may share common issues. Many tribal movements have been located in the tribal belt of Middle India, significantly in the state of Jharkhand. Jharkhand is one of the newly formed states of India, formed in the year 2000, and it has witnessed a long history of resistance. The charismatic Birsa Munda was an Adivasi leader who led a major uprising against the British. With the spread of literacy, the Adivasis began to research and write about their history, their myths, their cultures, their customs and practices. This helped create a unified ethnic consciousness and a shared identity of the Jharkhandis. With increasing number of Jharkhandis getting education and government jobs, they grew an intellectual leadership that formulated a demand for a separate state. Their experiences of marginalization and injustice was mobilized to create a shared Jharkhandi identity and inspire collective action that eventually led to the carving out of Jharkhand from South Bihar in the year 2000. The northeastern states have a number of tribals, and the different tribes of Assam were conscious of their distinct cultural identity as well as their traditional autonomy. The tribes had been isolated from the Indian mainstream and were able to maintain their own worldview and their social and cultural institutions. With the process of state formation by the Indian government, the tribes were unsure of the level of incorporation within the administrative machinery of Assam. So there's been a surge of ethnicity in the northeastern states. So there's a search for autonomy within the framework of the Indian constitution. The ecological issues are central to the tribal movements, along with cultural issues of identity and economic issues of inequality. Now we move on to the last section, that is the women's movement. So, 19th century social reform movements had raised various issues concerning women. The early 20th century saw the growth of women's organization at the local and national level. So we have number one, WIA, or the Women's India Association of 1917. Number two, the NCWI, that is the National Council for Women in India of 1925, and the AIWC, that is the All India Women's Conference of 1926. Now, these began with a limited focus, but the scope expanded over time. It has been wrongly assumed that only middle class educated women were involved in social movements. Women, along with men, have actively participated in agrarian revolts and struggles, whether in tribal areas or rural areas or urban areas. Example, the Tehabaga movement in Bengal and the Telangana armed struggle and the Worli tribals' revolt against bondage in Maharashtra. Now, mid 1970s, that is post independence, there was a renewal of women's movement in India, and this can be termed as the second phase of Indian women's movement. This phase was marked by changes in the organizational strategy as well as ideologies. Also, there was a growth of autonomous women's movements, that is, movements independent from political parties, as it was felt that political parties tended to marginalize women issues. Note, this is distinct from women's organizations that had link with political parties. So the new issues taken up were violence against women, the issues of land rights and employment, sexual harassment and dowry, etc. Not all women do not suffer the same level or kind of discrimination. That is, the concerns of the educated middle class woman is different from the peasant woman or the Dalit woman. So, as we move forward in the 21st century, we find that there has been a greater recognition that both men and women are constrained by the dominant gender identities. For true freedom to grow and develop, a gender just society should be created. The idea of a gender just society is based upon two important factors. Number one, the educated woman with her multiple roles. Number 2, the improved sex ratio. So we have the Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao Yojana by the Government of India as an important effort in the actualization of a gender just society. So, social movements show the dialectical relationship between the individual and the society. And social movements arise because individuals and social groups seek to change their conditions and, in the process, end up changing themselves and the society.